Buenas tardes a todos.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joe Bonfil, the happy publisher of Patrick in Reservoir Books. I would like to say thank you, first of all, to Fundación Telefónica for hosting us. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all of you that are online. Thanks to Andrea Aguilar for accepting to have this chat with Patrick. And of course, thanks to Patrick for coming to Spain. This is our first international visit in months since the pandemic broke out. Patrick, I mean, we don't have to introduce him, I think. He's an author. I mean, we've published the book Say Nothing last year with a great success in terms of critics and readers. We have published 6 editions. We are very happy with that book. We've just published Empire of Pain, his last book, that was published before summer in English, and last month, it was published in Spanish. He is a very well-known journalist in the US. He works for New Yorker. He is the author of 4 books, and he's someone that does almost everything good. His articles, his podcasts, his editions. He has been awarded with Orwell Prize. He has the prize of, he has different prizes and many more to come. So he has been we don't have to introduce you really. Andrea will talk to him, and there will be a Q&A later on. If you want to pose any question, he will answer them. Thank you very much.
So it is my great pleasure and honor to be here today with Patrick Radden Keefe. Patrick's work has become very popular in Spain thanks to his previous book, Say Nothing, in which he dived in the story of the Irish Troubles. And he wrote about it, starting with a crime story, the crime of Jan McCoville, right? McCoville, yeah. That book was one of the best books, non-fiction books published in Spain last year. Now this year he comes back to the stores, to the bookstores, and we have him in Madrid. He was yesterday in Barcelona to talk about El Imperio El Dolor. It's a book about the opioid crisis. And yet again, Patrick takes a personal turn to tell this story, and he decides to talk about a family again. And he talks about the Sackler family. So I want to start off by asking Patrick, why does he goes always to the family thing, right? Is that a good way to start a story? Is that how you feel that your audience is captured and ready?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I should say thank you all for coming. Thank you for doing this. This was a conversation we were supposed to have almost 2 years ago, and it got postponed. It was supposed to happen in New York, and now here we are having it in front of all of you here in Madrid. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you all for coming out. I guess I am interested in families and family dynamics. Certainly these 2 books both have elements of family, and a number of pieces that I've written for The New Yorker about relationships between brothers and sisters and mothers and sons and daughters. And so I think, to be honest with you, I don't even know that it's calculated in terms of what I think the readers would engage with. It's really more what engages me, that's a lens for looking at something that I tend to like. And I think family dynamics are fascinating, and maybe it does help with the audience in the sense that most of us can relate in some way, right? We've had relationships, you know, be born into a family or leave a family or have a dysfunctional family, but we all have some perspective on that.
So in this book about the Sackler family, Patrick backtracks and moves back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and sort of, sort of traces back the story of big pharma companies in the U.S. And the story of Arthur Sackler, who's the eldest brother, who's a doctor. Now, there are certain things that I found very interesting about his story. And one of them is the overlapping between, facts and data and medical stuff, because he was a doctor, publicity, because he was in the advertising business, and journalism, because he edited and started several medical publications. And it seems to me that the blurring of the lines between those three fields, it's truly problematic. At the same time, it sort of promotes some good things, right? Like Arthur, as you explain in the book, worked in a hospital, in a mental hospital in New York, in Creedmoor, in Queens, and he advocated the idea that there was a chemical dysfunction in mental illnesses, and that's what inspired partly the research and some of the medicines that made him rich in the beginning, right, or popular, or so.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's very. I like the way you put that, the way you describe the blurring of lines, because on some level, for me, this whole book is about the blurring of lines, conflicts of interest, different realms that are kind of collapsed into one another. On a deep level, it's a story about medicine and commerce, and the way in which commerce and the profit motive can pollute medicine and pollute healthcare. And so Arthur Sackler, for me, was an amazing character. I mean, he's if I were a novelist, I couldn't write somebody with such depth and richness. But also, he was helpful as a device, because his whole life was about the blurring of lines. And you see this in his personal life, where he has a first wife, and then he leaves her for the second wife, but he still maintains a relationship with the first wife, and then eventually there's a third wife, and he's kind of doesn't want to make any sort of firm decision about which family is going to be his family. He kind of wants to have it all. And professionally, it was the same way. So he trained as a physician, as you said, but he also, from a very early age, was involved in medical advertising, in the advertising of drugs. And in his mind, this was a kind of harmonious meshing of his interests. I think in retrospect we can look back and see that there were problems here. As you said, he gets into journalism eventually and starts publishing a medical newspaper, and the medical newspaper is filled with articles about the benefits of drugs, and he happens to also be in the drug business, and he does drug advertising, and the drug advertisements run in the newspaper, and he never informs anybody that he has interest in all these different things, and they give the newspaper for free to doctors all across the country and eventually around the world. And so they're sort of served up this little bundle of conflicts of interest, and Arthur has his hands in everything. So it was...
There's one character in the book that I was very intrigued, and it's a Spanish man, exiled, called Felix Martí Ibáñez, who's a Republican who moves to New York, and who's very much involved with Arthur Sackler, and who was just a good friend of the family, who made a good fortune with the Sackler and good business. And, could you tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, I mean, this was a big find for me because Arthur Sackler had two brothers. So it was Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, and they grew up in Brooklyn during the Great Depression. Their parents were immigrants. All three brothers became doctors, and this book is about three generations of their family, starting with that first generation. But the family was very, very secretive. And, in the present day, the third generation of Sacklers and the second generation didn't want me to write the book at all. They didn't cooperate. They wouldn't give me any access. So I was forced to be creative. And in the case of the Sackler brothers, who are all dead, those three brothers, they didn't leave any papers anywhere because, of course, they were too secretive for that. They would never leave their papers to a university or an archive. So I started to wonder, well, who were their friends? Did they have confidants in life who did leave their papers? And this is how I discovered this guy, Felix Martí Ibáñez, who led a very colorful life. He was wounded in the Spanish Civil War. He was a doctor, but also a writer. He was kind of a Renaissance man. He ends up in New York in the 1940s, and he befriends these three brothers. And his interests, like theirs, are quite diverse. So he's interested in pharmaceuticals, but also psychiatry, and also pharmaceutical advertising and marketing and academic journals about medicine. And when Felix Martí Ibáñez died, he donated all of his papers to Yale University. So this is before the pandemic started. I went out to New Haven, Connecticut, and there are, I don't know how many, it's like 24 boxes of his files. And I'm certain there are journalists and writers in the room, and maybe academics, so you can probably relate. I mean, for me, nothing is more magical than to sit down and be handed this huge archive. And so Martí Ibáñez, because he kept all these letters, I was able to read letters from the Sacklers and these personal artifacts, wedding invitations, birth announcements, bar mitzvah invitations that they sent to him because he was one of their closest confidants.
So when you say that you were forced to be creative because you never spoke with any member of the Sackler family, it basically means that you had to confront a trove of documents. So how do you go about it? How do you select what you want? I mean, also, the book spans from the 1940s to basically 2020. It's got like say nothing, good notes and everything that Patrick writes. There's a back, you can trace back where he found what he wrote. You're very careful with that. I would like you to explain how you go about that and why do you feel it's so important to have all these notes incorporated?
Yeah. I'm very glad that you said this because a number of people from my Spanish publisher are here this evening, and the notes I think were quite a headache for them. So I'm pleased to have an opportunity to explain why I think they were necessary. So the kind of writing that I do, it's nonfiction, and tends to draw on a huge amount of research. But I don't want it to read like an academic work. I don't want the reader to feel as though this is a book written for specialists. I hope that when specialists read the book, they feel that it has integrity, but it's not primarily written for specialists. It's not primarily written for people who know. I didn't write Say Nothing for the person who's already read 10 books on the Troubles. And as a reader, I have something that annoys me when I'm reading long-form journalism or nonfiction books, which is when I feel as though the writer has done a great deal of amazing research. And then what they do is they basically push all that research across the table at me and they say, I read it all, now you can read it all. And as a reader, I get frustrated when I feel as though somebody's just kind of regurgitating all of the research that they did and not giving any thought to selection, what they can present, what they can leave out, how they shape it. So for me, what I want to do is distill that research into something that is a really compelling read. I just talked about this in Barcelona, but there's an image that I often think about when I'm doing this kind of work, which is if you ever go to a pond and you see ducks. I should say, for clarity, I mean ducks, not dogs, but ducks, the creatures that float around on ponds. I think some people last night thought I said dogs, but the dogs swim too, but it doesn't look the same. So when you see a duck floating across a pond, what you see above the waterline is this beautiful creature serenely moving. It's just gliding as if on glass. What you don't see is that underneath the water, the duck is furiously paddling in order to
keep afloat.
And I think of the notes as the paddling, where for many readers, they're going to read the body of the book and hopefully just be absorbed in the narrative, and they don't have to think about, well, how does he know that and where did that come from? And I think probably most readers of my book never look at the notes. They're aware that they're there, but they don't engage with them. But then for the reader who does want to engage, I want to show my work. I want some transparency so that people can track down where various things came from.
This book is also some sort of homage to other journalists who have preceded you in looking into the Sackler Secretive family. There's an early case, a journalist who found out that all the doctors and physicians who were quoted in order to promote a remedy, these were all fake. I mean, there were no such doctors, and if you sort of follow the trace, it led nowhere. And this eventually took, it brought down Welch, the president of the FDA, right?
The head of antibiotics at the FDA, yeah.
Yeah. But then you talk about others, like Meyer and the Jason Blair scandal. You also talk about Sam Quiñones and his book. So it's a twofold thing, right, with the opioid crisis. I mean, partly it took a long time for journalists to figure out what was going on. Also, in the whole business of pharma, journalists have sort of bought the story that the pharmas were selling for many, many years. So where do you stand? How do you look at, the role of journalism in the opioid crisis and also confronting like the big pharma companies?
Yeah. Well, it may not surprise you to hear that I think, at their best, I think journalists are heroes. I think we do hugely important work. And right now in 2021, I think that work is under assault in all kinds of ways, that it's a fragile time for journalism. In the specific case of this book, on the one hand, the book it's a biography of a family over 3 generations, a family that does some quite bad things along the way. But it's also a story about systems and how the systems failed. And so part of what I think is notable is that this is about the failure of the FDA, the regulator in the U.S. that allows, determines which drugs can be sold and how. A failure of the Department of Justice in Washington.
Medical journals.
A failure of medical journals, a failure of doctors, the whole medical establishment. The DEA, you could go on and on about all of the different institutions that failed. Journalists didn't. And Barry Meyer, who wrote for the New York Times and was one of the first people to really write about Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family 20 years ago, I think he's a hero in this story. And so part of what I wanted to do is, I'm very aware that there's a lot of original work in this book, but I'm also following in the footsteps of people who were very brave and, very early on took on this company. And so I wanted to tell their story and show that, where other institutions failed, journalists sort of stepped up and showed scrutiny.
At the same time, Arthur manipulated many journalists.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that
and he wrote a column for years and years and years.
He did, though, in a newspaper that he published. So, he was a little bit self-dealing there. But yes, I mean, I think there are all kinds of ways in which the press can be taken in which the press can be slow to turn scrutiny at companies or can kind of buy what the companies are selling. But in this case, I think there were, or in the case of Barry Meyer, there's a story in the book that I tell about this guy, Barry Meyer, who was at the New York Times, and he was writing about Purdue Pharma, and there's this amazing moment in 2003.
Where they tell him that he's got a conflict of interest because he's written a book.
Where he's written a book about this, and so then he goes to keep writing articles. Instead
of being applauded as an expert, he's sort of brought down.
The New York Times took him off the story, and because the company asked them to, pushed them to. And so it's a funny thing, right? Because people at the New York Times look back at that and say that was a big mistake. We shouldn't have taken him off the story. So it's a story in which the same institution is both heroic but also made a mistake in that case.
So here's a question while I was reading the book. So one of the first stories that Patrick tracks is the story of Valium, of this medicine that became hugely popular, and it still today is very popular. Sort of tranquilizers, or however we want to talk, to describe them, and how it was sort of a spin-off from other medicines that were, more powerful and sort of, wanted to control schizophrenia and other psychotic problems. So, you go from a very hard drug to sort of the mass market. And in order to approach the mass market, you come out with Valium, and then you create this legion of addicted people to Valium. And sort of the same thing happens with the opioid crisis and OxyContin. Doesn't it? Like, it starts off with MS-Contin for cancer treatment as a very powerful painkiller, and then they want to approach the mass market because that's where big money is to be made, and it's when they come up with this formula. But the truth is it's like far more powerful that they want to admit. Like, after spending so many, it's like the good side and then the bad side. So everything bad happens when you want to throw these medicines to the mass market.
Yeah, I'm glad that you picked up on that, because the first third of the book is devoted primarily to the life of Arthur Sackler. He dies in 1987, which is before OxyContin is even introduced. But I felt that in his life, you could see in embryo so much of what would come later. You can see the sort of seeds for what would come later. And so in the case of Valium, they had these what they call major tranquilizers, which were for people who were psychotic. And Roche, this company that he did the marketing for, realized that if you had a minor tranquilizer, something that was not as strong, it's not for somebody who's psychotic, it's for somebody who's just feeling a little anxiety at the end of a long day, that's a huge market. And so they marketed it that way, and it became the most successful drug in the history of the pharmaceutical industry at the time. And Arthur Sackler was getting profit for pretty much every pill sold. He was arranged a deal where he would be compensated in terms of the volume of pills that they sold, and they sold more pills than anybody ever had before. So this is the way the first big fortune of the Sacklers was built. When OxyContin comes along, it's a very similar scenario, and that, as you said, it was a cancer drug. They had an earlier cancer drug, which was for severe cancer pain. But there's only so many people who have cancer. And I found these emails. I mean, I have these, I quote them in the book, these high-level people at Purdue Pharma saying, the cancer market is great, but it's a limited market. What if we could find a painkiller that was for everyone, that was for, you could market to tens of millions of people? And what they end up doing is taking a drug that's actually stronger than the cancer drug and marketing it as effectively weaker, as safer, and as not addictive. And it turned out it is addictive, and that's where you get the seeds of this whole problem.
And partly it's addictive because the dose is supposed to be 12 hours, but it doesn't work for 12 hours. It only works for 8. So the people who are prescribed this drug end up like craving for this drug if they follow the instructions that their doctor gives them, right? So from the very beginning, I mean, the sort of addiction is planted there,
it's baked in, yeah. And you get, and then there's a pharmaceutical representative who worked for Purdue, who I quote in the book, and he said that he would go and visit doctors, and the doctors would say, well, the drug is only supposed to be 2 pills every 24 hours, so 1 pill every 12 hours. But my patients are saying that it's only lasting for 8 hours, so what I'm doing is I'm actually writing them a prescription for 3 pills for every 24 hours. And this guy who worked for Purdue, all of their sales representatives were compensated also on the volume of prescriptions that they got. And so what he said to me was, his first thought was, oh God, that's bad. You're not supposed to be doing it 3 times in 24 hours. But his second thought was, well, wait a second, that's an extra dose for me in the middle of the day that I'm gonna get compensated for. So you have this cynicism. Look, I'm sure we can talk about this if you'd like. It's one strange aspect of this is to be publishing this book in 2021, when I went and got my Pfizer shots, and I'm very grateful for them.
Pfizer is, appear, and Janssen too.
Pfizer bribes the FDA in this book. There's reasons to. But what I was going to say is just that this industry is capable of miraculous things. They do great things. It's not that I have any kind of blanket condemnation of big pharma as such. I think a lot of the problem comes into the marketing, the way these drugs are marketed, who they're marketed to, and how honest or dishonest people are about the upsides and the potential downsides of the product.
So do you think, so it's the way that these drugs are marketed that's problematic. Also perhaps guilt should be shared with like sales representatives, also doctors who were prescribing this and could see what the effect in their patients was. A good number of doctors was addicted, right? Ended up like totally addicted to opioids. I also wanted to ask you, so first, should guilt be spread and not only be concentrated in the Sackler family? Second, where are we standing today? Because in March 2021, Purdue Pharma dissolved, right?
No, it's being dissolved now. It's been in bankruptcy. I can sort of bring you up to speed. In terms of guilt, I mean, the first thing I would say is, as a writer, I feel as though it is my prerogative to choose what I'm going to write about. And sometimes it's the thing that is most important. Sometimes it's the thing that's the best story. It's usually some combination. Sometimes it's where you can get access and you can actually get the materials to tell the story. So in this case, I chose to tell a story chiefly about the Sackler family for a whole bunch of reasons. One of which is that there are a bunch of other books about the opioid crisis, and often there might be a chapter or two about the Sacklers. And as a reader, my experience when I read those books was always to say, well, wait, don't leave them. I'm interested. I want to go back to them. Tell me more about them. And that for me is usually a pretty good guide that I will want to spend time researching a book, and that hopefully people will want to read it. That's not to say that the Sacklers are the only bad actors in this story. The opioid crisis has killed more than 500,000 people in the United States in the last 25 years. And I don't mean to sound glib, but there's an expression people use in the US. They say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to kill 500,000 people. I mean, it's not, we cannot lay all the blame for this at the feet of the Sacklers. And I say in the book that there's other drug companies that behaved egregiously. There's consultants and lawyers, there's politicians, there's the FDA, there's the DEA, there's doctors, there's medical associations, there's medical journals, there's pharmacies, there's distributors. You can go on and on and on and on and on. And in the same way that when I wrote Say Nothing, there were some people who said, well, how can you write this book about the IRA? You need to write about all of the other guilty parties and the troubles. And I sort of resist the idea that I need to do everything in a kind of perfect, legal or political balance. I will focus where I focus and obviously not try and fudge the truth. And there's a lot about other bad actors in Say Nothing as well, but the focus is the focus.
When we last spoke over the phone about Say Nothing, you spoke about like sort of an epiphany at the end of the book. So Patrick had finished writing that book and he was rereading the draft, and while he was rereading his book, he actually had a breakthrough moment and figured out who had committed the crime. I wondered if you had any epiphany while writing this book, or if there was something that you were going after and that you feel that you found while you were writing, or that it escaped you.
Well, there was something similar, which was that, it wasn't nearly as dramatic as what happened at the end of Say Nothing, but there was something similar, which is that when I started work, I had a theory, which is that this is a big family. There's three branches of the family, multiple generations. Two of those three brothers had three wives each, so there's many, many different children and grandchildren. And I had this thought, which is, my first thought was, there must be some apostate. There must be some member of the family who is actually kind of disgusted by what their family has done and will maybe talk to me. And I looked and looked, and it was notable that there really isn't.
Not even Arthur's daughter who changed her name?
Oh, yes. Well, sadly she's dead. She's died of cancer. But yes, Arthur did have a daughter who changed her name. I think there was a lot that she was rebelling to about Arthur, but this was pre-OxyContin. So that was interesting and notable. The other thought that I had, though, is somebody must have struggled with addiction. Part of this story is that the Sacklers, when they learned that people were, and their company, Purdue Pharma, when they learned that people were becoming addicted to the drug and overdosing and dying, they said, well, the problem isn't the drug, the problem is these people. These people have reckless personalities and poor morals, and so they go out and they abuse drugs, and that's really on them, not on us. And that has been the company line for decades. And so I thought, but there's got to be somebody in the family who committed suicide or was addicted to drugs or had some problem. And sure enough, I cannot, I'm afraid, reveal for you how I found out, but I was looking into the address where Muriel Sackler, who was one of the wives of Mortimer Sackler, one of those three brothers, where she had lived. And I was looking into the specific, I knew the building and I knew the apartment number, and I was looking into the history. And I talked to somebody who knew about that place, and they said, oh, you know about what happened with her son. And it turned out that her son had struggled with drugs and
had jumped out of
mental
the window.
illness and had jumped out of a ninth floor window in 1975 and killed himself. And to me, that was this. I'd always known there was a brother who died young. I didn't know why, but that was a very. It was like an astounding moment in reporting to learn that.
So I have a couple more questions, and then I'm gonna open it up to see if you have any questions, and I'm sure you have. But so. This is about El Chapo Guzman and a discovery that Patrick made while writing a story for the New Yorker, where he also discovered El Chapo's addiction and to Viagra, right? How did that happen? And what crisis did that cause in Mexico?
Yeah, I wrote a couple of big pieces about the Sinaloa Cartel. It's funny, before I ever started looking at the Sacklers, I was interested in illicit drugs and drug cartels in Mexico. And for the second one, which was about it was about the capture of Chapo Guzman before he escaped and was recaptured. So it was about not the last capture, but the second to last capture. I interviewed these people who had been tracking him in Mexico, and in the state of Sinaloa, he was moving from safe house to safe house, and they were these amazing safe houses. They were all had these underground tunnels that went into the sewers, and he would move from one to the next. And the people that I was talking to had been listening in on the communications of all the people who worked for him.
Wiretapping.
Yeah, and they were talking about the logistics of it, and there were two big problems that they would have as he moved from one place to another in hiding. One was that he loved gourmet food, and so even though he was in hiding and moving around, they always needed to find ways to get him the food that he loved. Sometimes they would do these crazy things. They would show up at a restaurant, because he would like to go out to restaurants, and so what would happen is you'd be eating in a nice restaurant on the Pacific coast of Mexico, and suddenly all of these men would come in with guns, and they would very politely ask everybody to give up their cell phones, and they would collect the cell phones, and then El Chapo would come in with his entourage, and they would sit and they would eat, and then at the end of their meal, they would pay for everybody's dinner, return the cell phones, and disappear into the night. But the other thing that he always needed was Viagra. And the quote that one of these DEA guys gave me was, "He ate it like candy," which I thought was really something. And I had not thought about the consequences of being the person who told the world that Chapo Guzman needed Viagra, but after I published it, I got a call from somebody in Mexico saying, "What have you done? You're a dead man." But it turned out okay in the end, and Chapo was eventually recaptured.
So my very last question before we open up is also about another project that Patrick started and accomplished, which was a podcast called Winds of Change. And okay, so tell us a little bit about that podcast, which I loved, and about your friend Michael and your so Patrick seems to have all sorts of friends, and he's got like this spy community. Tell us a little bit more.
So this was a project that I did really between my very depressing book about the Troubles and my very depressing book about the opioid crisis. No, they're really not depressing, but dark subject matter in both of those books. And in between, I wanted to do something fun. So there was a crazy story that I had heard. I have this friend named Michael, who I've known for a long time, and he's one of these people he's a great source for me because he does a lot of strange things, and he knows a lot of strange people. And
so one of the strange things he does is to find jobs for people who've worked for the CIA and who sort of, after a while they want to quit CIA. So how do you go back to the job market after working in the CIA? And he's sort of...
It's crazy because they have resumes, their CVs are fake CVs, because a lot of the time they've been pretending, you have somebody who's in the CIA for a long time pretending to be an oil executive in the Persian Gulf, but they haven't really been an oil executive. And so then they leave the CIA, and they can't tell anybody they're in the CIA, so they have this resume that says they were an oil executive, but it's not like they can go and get a job in the oil and gas industry. So how does that person find a job? And my friend Michael is the person they call. So so he had heard this crazy story, which some of you may know. There was a song by the metal band the Scorpions called Wind of Change, which was a big, big hit. It was released right around the time the Berlin Wall fell. And it became kind of an anthem for freedom.
We're gonna play it while you're signing the books.
You're gonna perfect. That's right. It's honestly, it's like the soundtrack that follows me everywhere now. But it became sort of the anthem for the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the story that I heard from my friend Michael 10 years ago was that song wasn't actually written by the Scorpions. It was written by the CIA. And so the podcast is an 8-part series in which I try to get to the bottom of this rumor that the CIA might have written one of the most iconic heavy metal power ballads of all time.
Okay, so I think now we have time for questions. If you have questions, if you don't, I'll keep on asking. So anybody? Okay, Jaime over there.
Just give me 1 second if it's...
No, but you need to be recorded.
Do we have is there a microphone?
Okay, so are you working in a new podcast?
I'm not working on a new podcast. I will tell you what's funny is many people listened to Wind of Change. More people probably than will ever read any of my books. It was a huge kind of phenomenon all around the world. Lots and lots of people listened to it. And then they would get in touch with me and send me messages about their theories. And so every day I get emails about what Wind of Change Season 2 should be. So maybe at some point we'll do it. We're getting a lot of pretty off-the-wall suggestions.
So Jaime will ask in English. You don't need it.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi. Oops.
No, we cannot hear you.
Hi. Yeah. Hi. I was saying a bit of a larger question, but I lived in the US for many years, and I was always shocked by the widespread use and prescription of, mood enhancers and mood stabilizers, pain relievers, all this stuff. So my question is, is this something that you think the Sacklers started or took advantage of, or where do you think this issue comes from?
Oh, it's a great question. So there's a story I tell in the book about in the 1940s, the 3 Sackler brothers end up at this asylum in Queens, New York, and there are a lot of people struggling with mental illness there. And the methods used to treat them are quite brute force. There was a lot of electroshock treatment and then lobotomies. And the Sackler brothers sort of have this dream in the 40s where they say, wouldn't it be amazing if you could just give these poor people a pill, if there was a pill for schizophrenia? In fact, wouldn't it be amazing if there was a pill for everything? And it's funny because I look at that and I see idealism. I think it's kind of a beautiful idea, and it's very American, the idea that there's like a technical fix for everything, and that you need a kind of push-button solution to every problem. I do think that in some ways that idea, which is hardly unique to the Sacklers, but that optimistic idea in the pharmaceutical industry in the 1940s and 50s has kind of reached its logical conclusion in the US, where I have friends who take a pill to fall asleep, and then in the morning they take a pill to wake up, and there's a pill for everything.
And it goes to kids too.
It goes to kids as well. I mean, there's lots of, actually, since the book has come out, I've been hearing from lots of people who are concerned about Ritalin and drugs for attention deficit disorder for children. So I wouldn't lay all of that on the Sacklers at all. I do think in some ways it's a phenomenon that they took advantage of. I also think one of the themes of the book is that Well, let me put it to you this way. I've interviewed a lot of people who are addicted to opioids. Many of them now addicted to heroin, but many of them started with prescription drugs, either because they were prescribed by a doctor or because it was like they were 16 and they were at a party and somebody brought something down from their parents' medicine cabinet. Some of them started with OxyContin. And what these people tell me is, I would never in a million years as a 17-year-old have taken heroin. But when you offer me something that you say has been approved by the FDA, it was prescribed by a doctor, even if it wasn't prescribed to me, it was prescribed by somebody, I think there's a sort of illusion of safety, right? That you're not buying something from somebody on the street. And part of what's so awful about this tragedy is that many people had kind of an on-ramp to opioids with these FDA-regulated drugs coming from companies like Purdue. And then eventually what happens is their source of supply runs out, or their doctor's not writing them prescriptions anymore, and they move to heroin. That a lot of these people who said, I would never have started with heroin, they end up on it because the inhibition goes down when you're in withdrawal and you need a fix.
Part of what you explain is morphine, right? So OxyContin comes about because they want to move away from morphine, because doctors and the general public was sort of on alert against morphine. They felt morphine was a super hard drug and that you got addicted to it. It turns out that OxyContin was far more addictive, right?
Yes. So OxyContin there was this part of the reason OxyContin was appealing. It's the drug itself is oxycodone, which is a kind of a chemical cousin of morphine and also of heroin. They all derive from the opium poppy. But oxycodone didn't have the same stigma as morphine. And so there was this sense that, patients would be happy to get oxycodone because it didn't sound as serious as being put on morphine. But of course, what the company didn't tell people is oxycodone was much stronger than morphine. So,
any other questions?
Muchas gracias.
Oops. Can you hold 1 second? I'm not getting the...
La tengo que arrimar. El libro debe ser interesantísimo.
The book is probably very interesting, and I hope I can read it. But as he says, the problem lies on the control authorities. So I'm really scared, because if these organisms, these bodies fail us, we are in the hands of people like these criminals, and some people are backing them. If I, as a user, I get a prescription from my doctor, I could never imagine that this goes against my health. I think this is a crime against humanity, and I would also like to know if there haven't been any collective actions against this, because if this has happened to many people, I expect that these companies have been brought to bankruptcy.
It's about a regulatory like the FDA and the control from the government, and what did it fail and how did it fail, and as a consumer you would never guess that it's a poison if it's got approved and green lighted by the FDA. So what's left, she wonders. How can that be prevented? And then the second part of her question is about collective demands from trials and cases. And what's happened in the courthouse with those.
Thank you for the question. So OxyContin was approved in 1995 by the FDA, and there's a couple of parts of that. So the FDA says this drug is safe and it works. the same two questions that have been asked about the vaccines in recent years. And the FDA also approves the marketing claims that the company can make about the drug, and signed off on some pretty crazy claims, about how the way in which the drug was developed meant that it was less likely to be abused than other opioids, which they had no evidence of. This was not tested, this was a guess, this was wishful thinking. But the FDA allowed the company to put that line in every package. There was a guy named Curtis Wright who was the official at the FDA whose job it was to be the main judge of whether the drug could be sold and how it could be marketed. And Curtis Wright seemed to enjoy a very close relationship with the company during the year or so when they were working on the approval. And after OxyContin was approved, Curtis Wright left the FDA. And I'll give you one guess where he ended up working.
For the Sackler family.
He went to work at Purdue, and at 3 times his government salary. And in terms of whether the government has sort of figured that out or changed its ways, I was very interested in this question, and I wanted to ask the FDA about it all these years later, because I thought that they might, as an institution, and this goes to your question about blame, I thought that they might look back. It's mostly different people who work there today than who worked there in 1995. I thought they would look back and say, we really screwed up. That was not appropriate. We cannot justify how it is that this guy could have gone to work at the company after signing off on their drug. And we need to do an internal investigation about what his relationship was with them. So that's not what the FDA was doing or saying.
But then there's something like the FDA, something that you point out in the book that I find very interesting. Once the FDA green lights a medicine, then doctors can prescribe it for whatever they feel they want to prescribe it. So there's no indication, right? So if, I don't know, whatever morphine has been approved by FDA can be prescribed to me for a headache, right? So there's no limitation in that sense. Could that sort of put some limits to the pharma and the way that they market their product?
Well, it's hard because the FDA doesn't want to be in the business of telling doctors how to practice medicine, right? That's in some ways that they're struggling to do the stuff they're supposed to be doing, and that would be a huge additional responsibility. And it's sort of the same thing with Purdue Pharma. So there are these moments in the book that are quite, darkly funny, where the company knew exactly how many pills were getting prescribed. And so you have these rural communities.
Well, because they had already set up a business.
They had a business to track all of the prescriptions by all the doctors. And so you have these tiny little rural communities where you have one doctor who serves a very small population. And the company knew that, these doctors just prescribing OxyContin left and right, just way more OxyContin than could ever possibly be needed by the local community. And when they were asked about this later, well, what did you think was going on here? What they would say is, well, it's not our business to tell doctors how to practice medicine. Maybe that doctor had a perfectly reasonable explanation for the thousands and thousands of OxyContin prescriptions he was writing.
But should the FDA sort of track that? Like, going back to her question, like, what can the...
Again, I don't think they have the capacity. To round out my answer to you, when I asked the FDA for all of the emails of this guy Curtis Wright, because my question was, when did he start talking to the company about a job? Was he still at the agency? Was he still working on OxyContin? And they came back and said that all of his emails have either been lost or destroyed. So this doesn't feel to me like an institution that is particularly looking to right the ship in that respect. But for me, one thing would be looking at the relationship between people at the FDA and industry. Is there a cooling off period that you introduce where when somebody leaves government, there's a certain number of years before they can go and work in the industry, broadly speaking, or before they can go and work more specifically at a company that they have regulated, that they personally have regulated? I think those types of reforms, they won't be a panacea, but I think they would help. On questions of, can the FDA actually track the number of pills and so forth, I just think that's a capacity issue. I think it would get very difficult for the agency to do that.
What about the courthouse? Where are we standing?
Where are we now? So in 2019, Purdue Pharma, the company, declared bankruptcy because it was being sued in thousands of lawsuits. Every single state in the United States was suing the company for its role in the opioid crisis. But this still might seem a little strange to you because OxyContin generated all this money. So you might be wondering, well, how would they, OxyContin generated $35 billion since 1996. So how are they declaring bankruptcy? And the answer is that very quietly in the background, for 10 years, the Sacklers were taking money out of the company, siphoning money out of the company. I think, many people think, they were doing this because they knew this day would come. They knew that a day would come when there would be all of these lawsuits, just a whirlwind of lawsuits surrounding the company. And when that happened, they didn't want all the money to be in the company. They wanted it to be out of the company. So they took more than $10 billion out of the company. And then they said, it's got no money left. Bankrupt. And so the company ended up in bankruptcy court, and a deal was just finalized earlier this month. And the deal is that Purdue, the company, will cease to exist. It will be dissolved. It will get kind of recreated, but the Sacklers won't have any. They're going to give up their interest in the company. And the new company will continue to sell OxyContin, but the profits from those sales will go to the states to help them fight the opioid crisis. It's a little bit circular. The Sackler family have had this amazing deal where what they've done is they've
settled.
They've said that they will pay $4.5 billion to help redress the opioid crisis, that they're going to pay it over 9 years. And in exchange, this bankruptcy court judge in New York has said, nobody can ever sue you again about any of this. You'll have no legal liability. All of the states that were suing the family members, they can't proceed with their lawsuits. It's a kind of a grant of immunity that they're paying for. They're paying $4.5 billion. They will admit no wrongdoing. So they're not going to say they're sorry. They're not going to say they did anything wrong. They're going to pay the money. And I guess the last thing I would say is $4.5 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it's not. It's not a lot of money in the sense that the opioid crisis has cost more than $2 trillion. So this is a drop in the bucket. This is not much. But also for billionaires, the numbers are probably a little bit different than they are for you or me. So remember, they're paying the money out over 9 years, and they have an $11 billion fortune. That's how much money they have now. So I actually did some reporting on this. I talked to some people who invest money for very wealthy families. And they said, if you have an $11 billion fortune, most years you're going to get at least 5 or 6% return on $11 billion, just on the interest on that money and on very, assume just kind of modest investments. No whiz-bang spectacular investments, but just modest investments. You get 5 or 6% return on $11 billion. So what that means is, over 9 years, they can pay $4.5 billion without ever touching the main fortune. They can just pay it on their returns. And it means that when they're done paying the fine, they'll be richer than they are today. So $4.5 billion, is it a lot or is it a little? I don't think it's enough.
I have a follow-up question because there's an aspect that's very important in the book and in the Sackler family that we haven't touched upon, which is the philanthropy. So the Sackler family was a big donor of museums and very well-respected institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum, but also the Smithsonian, Harvard, Yale, Tufts. I mean, a very long list. The Guggenheim Museum. There's, I'm sure many of you have visited the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and there's this spectacular Egyptian temple. Now, that whole pavilion was paid by Arthur Sackler, but he was really a very savvy philanthropist, right? And this is something that I wanted to ask you, because this philanthropy looks like savings, right? I mean, and you explain it, you know, in the book, that even though he gives away a lot of money, he's always negotiating and cutting a deal with these institutions. There's always a return because of tax benefits and tax breaks. So in the end, it's like really good business for him, because he says, I'm gonna give you $5 million in 10 years, and the way that's gonna come back to him through tax breaks is actually he's making money. So could you explain a little bit on that, and what's happened to these institutions? Because the Sackler family has been big donors of museums, but also of science institutions and research. And another big donor has been Epstein. So 2 big scandals and 2 big donors out of the picture. So what's happening now, and what's your take on this philanthropy?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is an aspect we haven't talked about up to this point, but if you look at the beautiful cover that Reservoir Books did, that column there is important, because a lot of this story actually takes place in the art world, you know, not in the world of pharmaceuticals, but in the world of museums and galleries. It started in the 1950s when Arthur and his brothers started making money, and they started donating money to universities and to art museums, always with the stipulation that the Sackler name had to go on the wall. And there's a quote in the book from Arthur's longtime lawyer who said, if you want your name on it, that's not charity, that's a business deal. And this, for me, I have to tell you, was a bit of a revelation. I mean, I grew up knowing you would see the Sackler name. I've lived in New York for a long, long time, for 25 years, and on and off. And you go to the Sackler wing, the name is etched in marble on the wall. I grew up in Boston, and there's a Sackler gallery at Harvard University, Sackler Museum. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a while. There's a Sackler gallery on the Mall in Washington. And many of you have probably been to that. There's a Sackler wing. There was until recently in the Louvre in Paris. So this philanthropy is fascinating, and I don't think I had fully appreciated the extent to which, when the very rich give to these types of institutions, it is a business deal, and they are often getting a much better deal than the institution itself. We're so used to this, speaking in this register about the generosity of the ultra wealthy who give these gifts, but when you get into the paperwork and you look at the back and forth, the gifts very often, the benefits really tilt to the giver. And
it's interesting, Philip de Montebello, who's a big connoisseur of Spain, and he's now in charge of the Hispanic Society in New York, and how he never had a good relation with Arthur Sackler, right?
Right, exactly. So Arthur, the story I tell in the book is about how Arthur, for years and years and years, he would hint to the Metropolitan Museum that when he grew old, he would give his whole collection to them, this priceless collection of Asian art that he had acquired. And he got all kinds of perks, prerogatives, various benefits coming to him, because the museum always thought, we have to keep him happy, because someday he will give us his collection. And they did this for decades. And then what happened is Philippe de Montebello came in, and he just didn't, I don't think he liked Arthur, and he didn't want to flatter Arthur, and he was sort of sick of playing the game. And so what ends up happening is, after all these years of getting all these benefits from the Met, Arthur said, well, I'm not going to give you my collection. I'm going to give it to the Smithsonian. And there's this amazing moment when all these curators from the Smithsonian, the rival museum, they file into the Met, and they just get to kind of pick and choose all the best stuff, and they take away 1,000 objects and cart them off to the Smithsonian, where you can see them today. The interesting question, right, when you look at it now, is, were these institutions all reputation laundering for the Sacklers? This is a family making billions of dollars from a company that was selling a drug that was killing people. And yet it didn't really catch up with them. When I started work on this project in 2017, there was, nobody was asking the Sacklers tough questions when they went out and about. They were valorized in society. They were thought of as these great philanthropists. And were these institutions complicit? And that's a question that gets raised in the last third of the book, and I talk about the photographer Nan Golden, who launched an amazing series of protests over the last few years at these museums, saying you need to take this name down. And we've started to see the name come down, and it's come down from a number of places, among them the Louvre. If you've been to London, there was the Serpentine Gallery in London. At a certain point, the Sacklers gave so much money that they renamed it the Serpentine Sackler. And recently they just went back to Serpentine again. And it looks as though the name may come down from the Metropolitan Museum. It hasn't happened yet, but the museum has announced that they are going to make a decision soon. And there was an interview, I was encouraged. There was an interview with the head of the Met last week, and he was asked, well, what about the Sackler wing? Are you going to keep the Sackler name? And he said, a decision will be coming soon. We're all talking about this. And by the way, I've been reading this book, Empire of Pain. And I thought that was, who knows what they will decide. But I thought if they're reading the book, that is an encouraging sign.
Okay, it is. So we're going to leave it there. If you want your book signed, Patrick will be signing the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. Thank you all for coming.